Frank Zane is now in his early 80s. He still trains, he still carries visible muscle, he still looks like someone who understands the body far better than most people half his age. For the majority of retired bodybuilders, the years after competition tell a different story. The size goes, the definition softens, the physique built over decades gradually disappears, and within a few years there is little visible trace of what it once was. That pattern holds for nearly all of them. Zane is an exception. What he maintained decades after his last competitive appearance was not the result of favorable genetics or circumstance. It was the product of a specific deliberate system that he developed, refined, and continued living by while the rest of the bodybuilding world either expanded in size or faded from view. What follows is an account of what Frank Zane actually did after retiring. The shifts in his training, the principles guiding his nutrition, the psychological frameworks he applied, and the habits that kept one of the most recognized physiques in the sport from simply disappearing. To understand why that matters, it helps to first understand how exceptional he was during his competitive years. Frank Zane was born in June of 1942 in Kingston, Pennsylvania. He began lifting weights at 14 with a pair of dumbbells. While the bodybuilding culture of the 1960s and 70s was moving steadily toward the idea that larger was always better, Zane was working from a different premise entirely. He was not trying to maximize muscle mass. He was trying to identify what an ideal human physique actually looked like, proportionally, structurally, aesthetically, and then build toward that standard systematically. He competed on weekends while working as a high school mathematics teacher. He earned 2 bachelor's degrees, a teaching credential, and a master's degree in experimental psychology. The nickname the Chemist was not ironic. It reflected accurately how he approached the body, with precision, calculation, and a consistent focus on understanding the underlying system rather than simply following convention. Universe competition. Schwarzenegger was already among the most dominant figures the sport had produced, and Zane beat him, one of only 3 men in history to have done so. He accomplished this at under 200 pounds, competing against opponents who regularly outweighed him by 20, 30, sometimes 40 pounds. That detail is significant. Zane's entire approach was built on the conviction that proportion, symmetry, and a complete command of one's own physique carried more value than sheer mass. Winning at under 200 pounds against substantially larger competitors demonstrated that this wasn't an abstract principle. It held up in competition. He won Mr. Olympia 3 consecutive times in 1977, 78, and 79. During those 3 years, he presented what many observers still regard as the most aesthetically refined physique the sport has produced. Not the largest, not the most extreme, but the most balanced and precisely developed. A 29-inch waist, a vacuum pose of near impossible depth, and a symmetry that competitors today still study and attempt to replicate. His influence on bodybuilding's classic physique division is direct and widely acknowledged. The standard that division chases remains, in large part the one Zane established. In 1983, following a motorcycle accident that disrupted his final competition preparation and left him placing 4th, he ended his competitive career. What followed, how he managed the transition and maintained what he had built, is the subject of the rest of this piece. Before examining what Zane did in retirement, it is worth considering what typically goes wrong. The physical decline that follows a professional bodybuilder's competitive career follows a recognizable pattern, and understanding it provides useful context for what made Zane's approach different. When a competitive bodybuilder retires, the structure that organized training and nutrition disappears. There are no competition dates, no preparation phases, no external accountability. A schedule that was previously fixed becomes discretionary. Once it becomes discretionary, exceptions accumulate. A missed session, then another, then a week, then a month. The body responds accordingly, shedding muscle tissue it no longer has functional reason to maintain. Simultaneously, the dietary discipline that sustained competition condition relaxes. Initially in small ways, then more substantially. Caloric restriction lifts. Foods that were previously excluded return. Alcohol, which suppresses testosterone and accelerates muscle loss, becomes a regular presence. Reduced training and deteriorating nutrition affect the physique from both directions at once, and the results can appear quickly. A number of well-known bodybuilders from the sport's golden era became physically unrecognizable within a decade of retiring. Some gained significant body fat. Others developed serious health problems attributable to the extreme size they had carried for years. Joint damage accumulated over long careers made ordinary activity painful, contributing to inactivity that further accelerated physical decline. For many of them, the difference between competition photographs and photographs taken years later is stark. Zane observed this pattern. He saw what happened when athletes treated the sport as a temporary phase rather than a lasting commitment. He concluded that the same outcome was not acceptable for him. Frank Zane never fully stopped training after retiring. Not even in his 80s. This detail tends to get overlooked in discussions of his post-competition life, because retirement is commonly understood to mean stopping. For Zane, it meant restructuring. The twice-a-day sessions of his competitive peak, the high volume, the heavy compound lifts, the sustained physical stress, that version of training ended. But the practice of going to the gym, of placing his body under intelligent resistance on a regular schedule, never did. He has trained 2 to 3 times per week, consistently, for decades. And in his own words, the principle behind that decision is straightforward. The key to maintaining a physique is continuity, not intensity, not volume. Continuity showing up regularly, without extended breaks, keeping the body accustomed to what it is capable of. There is established science behind this. Muscle memory is a documented physiological phenomenon. Once muscle cells have been trained to a certain size and density, the cellular machinery that enabled that size remains in place even when the muscle shrinks from disuse. The nuclei that drove growth do not disappear. When training resumes, recovering lost muscle happens substantially faster than building it initially. The body retains a structural record of prior conditioning. The critical factor Zane applied was keeping that stimulus active, not at competition intensity, but present. A completely sedentary retirement diminishes the advantage of muscle memory over time. The nuclei eventually decline, the hormonal environment shifts, and the window for recovery narrows with each passing year. By training at a moderate, consistent level, Zane kept that window open. His muscles were never given a prolonged signal that the work had ended. He addressed this directly in interviews. I rely heavily on muscle memory these days. I don't have to train that much anymore to stay in decent shape, which is good because my joints couldn't handle a lot of this work now. It is a straightforward account of someone who understood both the mechanism and its limits. There is a further dimension worth noting. During his competitive career, Zane trained with significant weight, not as heavy as some of his contemporaries, but heavy enough. He later stated that this heavy training contributed to something beyond stage conditioning: retention. In his words, if you train heavy and then reduce your training, you hold your size longer. The density built through heavy resistance does not diminish as quickly as size developed through lighter, pump-focused work. Zane had built a physiological foundation that was more durable than average. By never fully stopping, he gave that foundation no reason to erode. What changed in retirement was not whether Zane trained, but how. The adjustments he made were not about reducing effort, they were about applying effort more selectively than he had during competition. The first significant shift was away from heavy barbell work and toward machines and dumbbells. This was a deliberate decision based on joint health. His shoulders had required surgical repair. His lower back had accumulated years of cumulative damage. Heavy barbell pressing, rowing, and squatting with serious weight carries long-term costs, and with no competitive objective, those costs were no longer justified. The change was practical, not a concession. Machine-based training allows force to be applied to the muscle without placing equivalent stress on the connective tissue and joints. Cables and machines guide movement in ways that reduce injury risk. Dumbbell exercises permit natural rotation at the shoulder, limiting impingement. Pull-downs replaced pull-ups. Smith machine presses replaced free barbell bench. Incline dumbbell curls, an exercise he was still filmed performing at 79, replaced the barbell curls that had built his arms decades earlier. The stimulus to the muscle remained. The stress on the joint diminished. He also adopted a specific training cycle in retirement that is worth noting. Rather than the rigid 3 days on, 1 day off rotation he had used during competition preparation, he shifted to what he called a 5-5-5-6 pattern, training 3 days out of every 5 for 3 consecutive weeks, then dropping to 3 days out of every 6 in the 4th week, before repeating the cycle. The rest built into that structure is not optional. It is structural. Recovery, which he understood as the actual mechanism of muscle retention, was embedded directly into the program. He kept his sets modest, often just 2 sets of 10 repetitions per exercise, but the quality of those sets was consistent. This connects to one of the most persistent elements throughout his career in retirement: the mind-muscle connection. Zane did not perform repetitions on autopilot. Every rep carried his full mental attention directed at the specific muscle being worked. He wrote about this and taught it to clients in private coaching sessions for decades. When performing a set, he once said, "There is nothing else, not your breathing, not the noise in the gym, not what comes after, just the sensation of the muscle working." That level of focus, he argued, made lighter weights produce results that heavier weights performed with divided attention never could. Then there was the treadmill. Zane has referenced walking on the treadmill repeatedly across interviews and blog posts, consistently enough that it functions less as a tip and more as a core element of his routine. He used walking during competition preparation as part of his daily practice, and in retirement it became more central still. He called it an old man's best friend, not dismissively, but as a genuine assessment. Walking is low impact, supports cardiovascular function, aids fat metabolism without significantly elevating cortisol, and keeps the body active enough to prevent the metabolic slowdown that affects many retired athletes. He added stationary cycling as well, building up to 30 minutes 3 or 4 times per week, specifically for endurance and to sustain energy levels. He He noted in his writing that over time, combining weight training with endurance work tends to leave you more energetic rather than depleted, provided the total volume is managed correctly. Zane has offered what may be the clearest summary of his approach in a single statement. He described the key to building the best possible physique within whatever genetic framework a person has as continuity and discipline, not talent, not the optimal program, not the right supplement stack. Continuity and discipline. Showing up repeatedly, through decades of training, through injuries, through a competitive career that ended, through aging joints and everything else that accumulates in a body over time, and continuing anyway. He also noted a physiological reality worth understanding. After the age of 40, the body loses roughly 1% of its muscle mass per year. Across 20 years, that amounts to 20% if nothing is done to counter it. The only effective response is never fully stopping, not training at competition intensity indefinitely, simply never allowing the body to forget what it is capable of. The sport of bodybuilding has produced men who built extraordinary physiques and then lost them almost entirely. It has produced men who built exceptional size and then spent their later years in chronic pain. Frank Zane built what many consider the most aesthetically refined physique in the history of the sport, ended his competitive career on his own terms, and then kept training, kept eating carefully, kept meditating, kept coaching, and kept demonstrating that what he had built was never something he intended to give back. He was never simply a bodybuilder between 1977 and 83. He was a bodybuilder who happened to compete between 1977 and 83. That distinction in how he understood himself, in what fitness meant to him, in how he organized his days for the decades that followed, is the actual answer to how he maintained his condition. The trophies collected dust. The physique did not. If the man who built the most aesthetically accomplished body in competitive bodybuilding history is still training at 83, still coaching, still writing, still active, the relevant question is not how he did it. The relevant question is what is preventing anyone else from doing the same.